Well, yeah, we want to thank Steve, Salo, and all the folks that are joining us from Infoblox today. Steve has been at Infoblox since 2010 and is currently a principal solutions architect in the Bay Area. Steve is a team lead with Infoblox Security Virtual Team and is a certified Infoblox Threat Intelligence Advisor, a CISSP, and CCSP. Prior to joining Infoblox, Steve was a network engineer for a large financial firm for over a decade and also managed DNS and other platforms for a regional ISP in the late 90s and early 2000s. That sounds interesting, Steve. I want to hear a little bit about that.
It was interesting. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks for joining us.
All right. So thanks, Patrick, and thanks everyone else on the team here. And I'll jump in. So yeah, the topic today that I want to talk about is the DNS and transitioning from attack vector to security control. So I'll just jump right in here, assuming it lets me go. Yeah. So a little bit more about me. Patrick, you did a great job of introduction, so I won't go into too much in depth here. But yeah, I started out kind of in the IT world, or I guess we could say the DNS world too, with the regional ISP in the late 90s, running a lot of bind. One of the most interesting things I saw was actually running bind on Microsoft. I wouldn't recommend that. I don't know why anybody did that, but one of the little ISPs that we acquired was doing that. So just interesting things. From there, I went on working for a large Fortune 500 as a network engineer, doing many things, including DNS and DHCP. And that's kind of where I got introduced to Infoblox in 2010. I actually came over to Infoblox and have been a principal solutions architect with Infoblox. So moving on to why we're here and what we're talking about today. So this is kind of the thesis, if you will. So DNS, it's a long time it's been an attack target, and I'll go through some of the history of that too as we go through here. But today, 90+% of malware is leveraging DNS at various stages of the kill chain, or if you want to look at MITRE ATT&CK, or different things, and it's really kind of become a top attack vector. So it's not just a target, it's become a vector. And there's a lot of things that, you can do to kind of flip it on the threat actors or on the adversaries and leverage DNS as more of a security control as well. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So to go a little bit of the history, it's not just history because these things are still occurring, but it started out as an attack target for things like DDoS, cache poisoning, hijacking. So go into a little bit more on that. So DDoS 101, everyone probably remembers back in 2016 when the Mariah botnet was leveraged for a large-scale attack on Dyn, generated upwards of 1.5 terabits per second of traffic, knocked out a bunch of websites, and basically because of the DNS that a number of companies were using on Dyn, inaccessible, didn't work so well. And that's kind of a common attack vector today. You see, ransom attacks where, we're going to launch a DDoS attack on you unless you pay us. And I still talk to, in fact, I talked to a customer today in the Bay Area that was looking at, okay, how do we mitigate some of these attacks that we're seeing? What can we do on our external authoritative DNS? So still an issue, and it's still relatively easy to do as well. I mean, there's not as many open resolvers out there anymore, but they're still out there. So open resolver is basically a DNS resolver on the internet that anybody can query to get an answer. You could look at like OpenDNS, for example, is technically an open resolver, although they have some more security, in play there. But anybody's bind server that's just running on the internet or not locked down appropriately, you send a query to it. The adversary does. Basically, they can spoof their source address so they're not tracked, but it goes off to a target, and you can do a query for something small, like an any record, or you can get a real nice amplification going on if you query some DNS records. So you can send a small number of queries, generate large volumes of attack traffic at your target DNS server for whatever domain they're trying to resolve, and basically push it over the edge at some point. So DDoS 101 is still happening today. Basically, one of the early ways DNS was used for an attack target. Another attack target, and it still happens.
I see what you did there with Dan.
Yep. Yeah. So DNS cache poisoning. So Dan Kaminsky got a lot of fame for this. The great late Dan Kaminsky, for exposing in 2008 some of the vulnerabilities with the DNS protocol, with how you could more easily spoof the source port and sequence numbers and all these different things that they fixed after that, or tried to fix anyway after that. But it was pretty easy. In cache poisoning, really the idea is I want to trick a recursive name server into putting something invalid into its cache for means of hijacking or redirecting customers to a false website or stealing their email or whatever it may be. So in this case, the adversary does some query to the target name server that they want to poison the cache. The target name server goes out to authoritative name servers and says, okay, I need to get the answer for this, expecting a good answer to come back. In the meantime, that adversary launches a large volume of spoofed responses against that target server that they're targeting, hoping to guess the appropriate sequence number and port and so forth. So that way the target name server will actually accept that response before the valid response comes back. And if they win that contest, then yeah, you can inject cache poisoning information into there. There was something more recently in the last couple of months too about how you could use ICMP to basically do some reconnaissance against servers and try to figure out what ports are potentially open and not, and kind of limit the volume or limit the number of ports you'd have to actually try guessing. So again, cache poisoning coming up again. DNS Sec was supposed to help address a lot of the cache poisoning issues. Actually, it very well could, but there's not everybody has implemented DNS Sec as far as signing their authoritative zones or basically doing DNS Sec validation. So we kind of need both sides of that to actually have DNS Sec be successful. I do see adoption continues and continues to increase, but we're nowhere near where we need to be for this to become relevant in really protecting DNS and creating that validation or that chain of trust as far as DNS records and zones go. So DNS hijacking, this still happens as well. And it's basically any means of getting in the middle, taking over an authoritative name server, rewriting the responses, taking over domain registration. Again, the same idea is I want to redirect, customers to a false website or, get some of their email. Back in 2013, everyone probably remembers this as well because it was pretty public, because the New York Times, basically the Syrian Electronic Army had basically compromised, not only compromised, but like social engineered their registrar and were able to hijack their domain for, a period of time. And think about the ramification of that. If somebody were to hijack a prominent news site today, it'd be a whole new definition around fake news. And a little history on this too. Back when I worked for that ISP in the late 90s, this actually happened to us. And it's kind of funny because we were actually talking about the time of becoming an official ICANN registrar and handling domain registrations and things like that ourselves. And then we let our domain basically get hijacked and taken over and had some very inappropriate content on what was supposed to be our website for a period of time before we got that fixed. So it happened back then and still, possible to happen now. So that was kind of how, DNS first got, its black eye was basically being that attack target. And then, the adversaries figured out, hey, DNS is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. Everybody's running it, everybody needs it. We can use this as an attack vector. So there's a lot of different things, ways that DNS is being used for those, purposes and attacks and so forth. So going into more detail on that, don't just take my word for it. That's an attack vector, or what you've seen yourselves. There's statistics out there, about the percentages of attacks over DNS and the financial ramifications of that, and things like data exfiltration over DNS and tunneling, and what's the average breach cost, and malware. Basically, 91% of it relying on DNS to carry out their campaigns, whether it be part of the infection or a phishing campaign, or basically anything that's using those malicious domain names that they've registered, or using DNS as a communication channel and so forth. And this isn't new either. If you look at the dates on some of these statistics here, these are all from 5 years ago, and it's still the case today. And often the financial numbers are going up for the cost. I mean, in the last year and a half alone with COVID, how many different things have we seen, in the news mainstream that, households, everybody knows about it. The pipeline attack the other week, SolarWinds, late last year. There's DNS often plays some role in that breach and in that campaign. So where does DNS sit in the cyber kill chain? So if you look at the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, you can almost make an argument for anywhere in here that, that DNS could actually potentially be part of that or involved. But if you look at reconnaissance, with your external authoritative DNS, you can query that and find out information about, where your mail servers are, what web servers you have, or what other information is out there. Or if you get inside and you start looking at DNS, that's like the map to everything that's in your infrastructure, all of the names to IP mappings, and there's a lot of valuable information in there. If you look at things like delivery for infiltration and basically downloads of data via DNS, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about that and how that works too, and exploitation, protocol anomalies, hijacking we talked about, command and control. DNS is a very frequently used command and control channel for beaconing and so forth, and even tunneling set up there. And then when you get to the objectives too, if exfiltration is your goal, DNS is a very very simple way of doing that, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on how that's done too, and some of the things that are so kind of looking on the flip side of the kill chain, looking at MITRE ATT&CK, kind of the same thing. And really you can, kind of pick and choose and go through the various techniques here or common knowledge. And you can see I've got some of the ones highlighted where, DNS fits in, very similar to the cyber kill chain, just kind of the, MITRE's kind of the more, I think, predominant at this point framework for that. So again, DNS being leveraged as a vector all over, all over the place. And a little bit more to back that up. This is from SANS in 2017. If you look there, kind of approaching the top, exfiltration and breaches over DNS, that's, the rising star there. And, way back earlier in my career, everything was, oh, we got to protect the web traffic and web servers and proxies and all that. And yeah, that's still very important. But, the adversaries have moved on and said, okay, what's the next easiest vector that we can leverage, and DNS often is the place. So exfiltration, kind of a little one-on-one on how this works and how simple it may be. So the adversaries will register a domain name, and it could be something 0-day that hasn't been recognized yet, reputational data on it, and I'll talk a little bit more on that coming up with newly observed domains and things like that as well. But basically, they can take some data and then encrypt it, or maybe do a hex dump on it, or break it up into chunks, turn it into DNS queries, and of course the firewall says, "Oh, DNS, I got to let that go out because we have to, do business with the rest of the world or communicate with the rest of the world." So all those DNS queries need to go out and look like a valid DNS query. So I'm not going to stop it. So it becomes kind of a convenient mechanism to go out. So you get an infected device in there, they get some information, they steal it from HR, maybe it's a social security information or whatever type of proprietary data. I'm getting a nice little echo, there we go. So break that up into, some sort of a encryption or a hex dump on the data, and then just append that as the label to whatever domain name the adversary owns. So foo.thief.com in this little example here. So we'll send that on to the enterprise DNS server, or really any DNS server that is reachable, and that query will just go out to the internet, go to the adversary's authoritative DNS server for that particular domain. they'll see the query information that'll, match what was sent out, encrypted, of course, but, they have the keys or whatever to reverse the encryption, and boom, they have the data. So it's, pretty simple. Is it trivial? I think so. I mean, if you look at this at first hand, like, okay, what is all this on the screen? But if you know even just a little bit about coding or scripting, I mean, these are two simple examples here from a Unix and from a Windows PowerShell example, using common, readily available command line utilities and tools, and how you can take a file. Looking at the Unix example here, take a file, do a hex dump on it, append that data into the domain that you want to send it out to, and then just basically just go through a loop and start sending that data out. And you can send it out rapidly, or you can send it out more slowly, depending on what security controls may be in place that you want to circumvent. So it's pretty trivial, for the adversaries, once they get in, to use DNS to start to exfiltrate data. So on the flip side of that, and I mentioned too, when we were looking at the cyber kill chain, you can also use it for infiltration. So, there was a tool released, or an article released a few weeks ago for DNS Stager. And it's basically an open source tool available that you can leverage, if you're part of a red team, for example, or maybe you just want to do something bad, if you will. But you can use this to really use the DNS protocol as a payload delivery, or be able to download data to it. So similar to data exfiltration, basically in this case, the client does a query for some record on the internet, and the response has that data, then information in the label. Client knows how to decode that data as it comes in. Client makes a number of queries, pulls a bunch of these labels in, decodes it, and now you've got a payload that you can execute in memory, or however the application, or it could be malware that's basically, I need to go get my delivery payload now, or some update, and it can usually use DNS to do that as well. So DGAs, these were kind of or still are, a nice way for the adversaries to kind of get around some of the controls of avoiding being on reputational data, and saying, hey, I'm going to register some seemingly random domain, and my malware is going to be coded to query that particular domain at a particular period of time, and I'll have my command and control server set up behind that domain. Simplistically, it could have been something like monthday.year.com. You register that domain on that day, and you set up your services behind that, and pretty trivial to do. There were a number of malware families that were leveraging that kind of from a simplistic perspective, things like Durcrypt and Bamitol and CC Cleaner, for example, or CCleaner. So DGAs got a little bit more advanced to where we now see dictionary DGAs. So basically you take, dictionary 1, dictionary 2, whole list of words, and then kind of put them together with an algorithm to create, human readable domain names, so they look more legitimate potentially. And then again, same thing, the malware is basically coded to use the same algorithm to determine what domain name it's going to connect to at a particular period of time. And away it goes. So again, that gets a little bit more, complicated. There's things that can be done, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too, as far as DGAs. And another thing that comes up when you talk about DGAs, at least more recently, is the SolarWinds attack, or Sunburst. And I've heard DGA mentioned a lot with that, and there wasn't really DGA used in that. It was more like a dynamically generated labels, if you will. So they had specific domain names like AV, what was the domain? AV, svmcloud.com was one of the domains that they were using. And to determine who they had compromised, they would take the Windows domain of the enterprise, the organization they had compromised, basically do an encoding of that, set that as part of the label for what they were querying. So on their control server, when they would get see those authoritative, or see those recursive queries, they would say, oh, look, we've compromised this organization or that organization, because they would decrypt that label and understand that. So it was really more of a dynamically generated or domain label generation algorithm versus a DGA, but just something interesting to point out. And again, DNS was leveraged there as part of the tactics and techniques. So another kind of vector is fast flux, and this one's, we still see some use of it as well. And basically it's the idea of, I've got a name and I'm going to, continuously move my hosts behind that. So potentially changing the IP addresses behind that. Once you know the name, you can use controls from a DNS perspective to block resolution to that name. But if you don't understand all of the IPs that are behind that and you're not blocking the name, then you've got to keep up with that from the firewall perspective and try to figure out what IPs you need to add to block the list. So fast flux was an effective way for quite a while too, to basically continuously hide and move your control servers and so forth. Yep.
Are you going to get into any of the solar flare, solar winds type of attacks, and why that one was so unique and so devastating?
So not in detail, no. It was, I guess, it was partially, unique and devastating because of how long it went on and how it got into the supply chain and so forth, and kind of the the blast radius that it hit. Yeah, maybe good for another conversation, but yeah, not going into more detail on it today, other than what I mentioned just about the labels from a DGA perspective.
Understood. I don't want to hijack. Thank you.
Yep, no worries. Yeah, if there are any other questions though, feel free to interrupt me if you like, or we can wait to the end as well. Okay, so that teases us up to talking more about DNS as a security control. So I was talking about being an attack target, an attack vector. So now what can we do about it, and how can we take what's been that vector and turn it to your own advantage to protect the infrastructure and mitigate some of these different things that are going on. So some of the challenges, if you think about it, kind of high level, you want to prevent data leakage via DNS, so stop those tunnels and those command and control channels and so forth, and stop the advanced persistent threats and malware from using DNS because they're using it as a vector. So maybe we can use DNS as a control as well, and then also defending against those DNS targeted attacks. That's still another challenge. So visibility. And this is really, I think, key. And when I talk to a lot of security practitioners, they always at least understand and know that, hey, I want to get the DNS query logs. I need that information. Might not understand what they need to do with it, or what they can do with it, but they understand from a forensic perspective, if something happened, there's a lot of value in that DNS query information. So even better is the DNS query response information. So with query response logging, like in this example I have here, you can see really important information like, hey, when this query occurred, the client IP address that generated that query, what the query was for, in this case is for google.com, the type of query, and then also the response, which depending on, what you're looking for, the response could be, equally or more interesting than what the actual query was for as well. So I can see the response is just a standard A record and an IP address. So there's a lot that you can do from a query logging perspective. Just about every DNS resolver out there by Microsoft, what have you, is capable of generating query and or response log information. And then you can take that log information and you can feed it into, log collectors, and you can put things into, depending on how advanced you may be, feed it into different tools that, add enrichment and additional data, and you can start to do some analysis on there and get all of that, query data and be able to do something with it. I mean, that's really what needs to be done. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on that as well. But this is really from a control perspective, having that visibility, it starts to enable you to start to use it as a control. Not really a control yet, because you're seeing things that are going on, but it lets you see, for example, if there's queries to malicious domain names and you know what those domain names are, you have that visibility in there. Or if there's things like, data exfiltration occurring, you can, do some viewing of the logs and so forth and try to figure out what's going on. So that brings me to, all right, so what about behavioral analytics and machine learning? So yeah, I'll go into more on this as well, but if you have all this log data and you're trying to look at it, and you can have literally tens of thousands of DNS queries per second. So that's not really very feasible to look at and analyze by hand and try to look for anomalies and different things like that. But if you did that, you might be able to find some things, and you can say, okay, there's some queries for this name. We think it's funny, and these are the IP addresses that it's resolving to. Let's block that at the firewall, or and work with some other security control to do some blocking there, or maybe you say, yeah, we're going to, if we see long queries, we'll just figure out if we can block those, or if we see high query rates from something, maybe we'll see if we can block that. And there's different things you can do, but they're not completely effective, especially against some of the APTs and against the more advanced adversaries that are out there that figure out, all right, I know I need to go low and slow and just kind of drip my queries through. That way, if anybody's watching, and they're probably not going to be able to put the pieces of the puzzle together, or at least not before I've already accomplished my task. So machine learning, behavioral analytics, that's really the way to go. I know a company that can do this basically on their platform in a number of different ways, but there's other solutions out there too that you can feed log information into and start to do analytics on it to kind of determine and baseline and figure out what's valid and what some of these anomalies and attacks and so forth. And that can help with the 0-day things too. So if you're doing the behavioral analytics on the domains, and there's some of those malicious queries out there or something that looks like tunneling and so forth, then you can start to use DNS then as a control to be able to block some of those if you're doing it on the platform itself. So how do you block things like that? And this is where the DNS can really become a security control, is with response policy zones. And this is often known as DNS firewall as well, which became kind of a marketing term, and it's used across many platforms now. But under the hood, it's often response policy zones or some form of response policy zones. And it's basically a way of setting a policy, and you can leverage custom lists or indicator lists or threat feeds and so forth of known malicious domain names and or IP addresses that domain names could potentially resolve to, and then basically take action on the DNS level. You can say, hey, I want to block any queries that go to these malicious domain names, or hey, I want to block anything that happens to resolve to this IP address that I know is malicious, and do that on the DNS server. And there's some value in using that as a control, because it can scale to millions and millions of indicators, as opposed to what you maybe do on a traditional firewall, with rules loaded to block IP addresses and so forth. So you can really scale that. And, it's really pretty simplistic as well. Client queries for a bad site, badsite.com. The secure resolver that's, using reputational data can basically return an NX domain or no response at all. So the query never goes out. That client's blocked from, trying to go to that bad website. Or if it was malware that was querying out, that never makes it out to the adversary DNS for recording that information. Or if the client clicked on a phishing link in an email, because the end users always inevitably do that at some point, and it resolves to a bad domain name that you have on your list of bad domains, or you're getting some sort of a threat intel with that information, then you can use the DNS as a control to block that. So Patrick, when you had asked about newly observed domains earlier on, just before the presentation, so yeah, this is part of what you can leverage from a reputational perspective, and that can really help with those 0 days and maybe even some of the DGAs too, depending on when they're when they're registering it and when they're actually first observed in the wild. So there's newly observed domains, and there's one more kind of category of that as well that I'll speak to on the next slide. But the nod type of data is basically, hey, this domain was registered maybe 2 years ago. That's fine. It sat there dormant, and then hey, we started to see DNS queries for it in passive DNS or through some mechanism. And then it goes into that nod feed to say for the next, 48, 72 hours, whatever it is. That's going to be part of that reputational data where we want to, block that and not resolve that. And odds are, if it's something that's going to be used for malicious purposes, it'll have been detected by, other means and put into somebody's reputational data within that period of time before it, kind of gets the all clear and can go. So that's one form of using that reputational data to kind of give you that nice little buffer there. Similar to nod domains, there's also feeds for fresh domains. So the difference is newly observed versus freshly registered. So these are domains that the adversary registered today. So they show up in feeds to say, okay, anything that was registered today, we want to block that for the next 72 hours as well, and not resolve any of those. So it kind of makes good sense from a business practice, because usually you're not turning up a domain immediately on the same day that you're registering it, unless you're up to no good. So again, this kind of gives another little buffer way of mitigating against some of those. So other types of feeds that are available out there you can get. And there's tools where you can or you can use different tip platforms as well, where you can take any indicators, basically put them into an appropriate format that can be consumed by a DNS server or a DNS platform, and start to use those for mitigation. So there's things like malware, ransomware. You can do geo-based type of blocks with DNS. So you can say, hey, I don't want to resolve any queries for anything that's in China. Or Russia or something like that, because my line of business says we don't do any business with them. There's no reason for anybody to query anything over there. You can do that from a DNS perspective. You can just block anything that resolves to those addresses. There's other feeds available more with phishing and abuse, or sanctioned countries as well. And then there's a newly observed and fresh feeds that we just talked about as well. Another thing that's interesting too, from kind of a feed perspective, is industry-wide. If you actually do the analytics or analysis on a number of these different feeds that are available out there, there's often very little overlap between them, because each vendor has kind of a different view of the world and what they look at and what they focus on. And so it's good to have diversity in there, and good to have diversity, defense, and depth as well, so that you have multiple feed types and sources and platforms in place to provide those security controls. So you may be thinking in the back of your head, okay, well, what about .dot and .do? Aren't those new kind of DNS security type of standards? Or are those security controls too? Or how are they helping out, or what's going on with those? So DOT, or DNS over TLS, was approved in 2016, and it's basically kind of a mechanism of encrypting or securing the DNS communication from the client to the resolver, and it uses port 853, so it's kind of a unique port for that. DNS over HTTPS, or DO, was approved in 2018, and it uses port 443, so the same as HTTPS. So that can be a little bit more challenging, and I'll go into a little bit more information on that too, because web traffic uses that port. So how you can tell the difference between the two. But at the end of the day, both of them are really intended to encrypt DNS communication between the client, so whether it be your device or your laptop or your server or whatever it is, mobile device, and the local or the recursive resolver. So so it's designed to encrypt that communication between client and the recursive resolver. Okay, so is that really privacy because it's encrypting it so you can't see it, or is it security? Kind of where does that sit? And really, if you think about it, primarily these standards were introduced to protect consumer privacy. So consumers were not happy that their ISPs could see everything they were doing because they could see all of their, DNS traffic. So you have a, publicly available DNS over HTTPS or TLS resolver out there. You can, make your secure DNS connections so that they're encrypted. Nobody can see what you're querying for except for that, entity, of course, but nobody in the middle can see that. Nobody can, monetize that or do anything with that. And there's also some security that it addresses, if you think about it too, because really from a protocol perspective, the last mile wasn't protected. So that connection between, say, your client resolver and the sub resolver and your enterprise, DNS, that's not encrypted either, and that's visible on the wire and so forth. So it does kind of protect that from any spoofing or inception and so forth. So protecting that. But there's a number of challenges if you think about it from an enterprise perspective, because like I mentioned, the resolvers that are out there available for the consumers. So consumer operating systems like Windows and iOS and Mac OS and so forth, and browsers and so forth, they're enabling dot and do now, so they can go ahead and they can say, okay, we need to make a secure connection out to this unauthorized DNS resolver on the internet. So yep, we'll go ahead and we'll do that. We'll bypass the enterprise DNS server because I just want to get to Google or whatever other website that's out there. That's really where I want to go, and all that communication just goes out there, and it's never seen by enterprise DNS from a protocol perspective. It looks like 443 traffic, so it looks like, oh, it's just web traffic, let that go through the proxy and so forth, and remember that query log information that I talked about how important it was from a visibility perspective to have that data. Well, with DO in the middle, you don't get that anymore. That's gone, because you can never see that from being able to encrypt any of the data or be able to see that on your DNS server, your DNS resolver. So it introduces some significant challenges, and there's some other challenges too. But I mean, the big one is really bypassing any of your enterprise security controls that are maybe leveraging DNS. And hey, what about malware? So yeah, now DO is also an attack vector as well. So back in early 2019, remember 2018 was when DO was first basically ratified. The Galua malware is basically 7 months later, was first starting to use DO as a communication method. And late 2019, malware attacks increasing using DO. 2020, the Cobalt Strike is leveraging DO now for as a vector as well. And that leads us to 2021 recently, where the NSA issued warning to enterprises saying that, hey, wait a minute, adoption of these encrypted DNS services can kind of lead to a false sense of security and bypass any controls that you have in place. So you need to do something about that. You can't just rely or trust your web browsers and your operating systems and whatever to make the right choice. You need more control over that, and you need to do something from a DNS perspective to be able to either mitigate the use of dot and do, or run your own encrypted resolver to be able to terminate dot and do, and then you can still have all of those communication visibility and control perspectives. So can DO become even more challenging? Yeah, it actually can. So there's a new standard being proposed for ODO, oblivious DNS over HTTPS. And basically the idea is here for, again, it's really more privacy focused, where not only, does it, mix up and you don't see any of that traffic from an enterprise perspective, even though the secure resolver out the internet would know, okay, these were the IP addresses that were querying these particular domain names. Oblivious DO basically introduces more proxy configurations in there. So basically the client IP address and the DNS transaction are never really fully seen by the same entity. So it kind of, obfuscates more of that information. And again, focused on, consumer privacy and hiding that kind of data. But from an enterprise perspective, it gets to be pretty scary if you've got, devices that are just communicating out to any of these, open, secure resolvers that could be, potentially being leveraged by malware and other tactics as well. So wrapping up here on the presentation and going to questions pretty soon. Now what? So, what now do we do for control? So really, log the DNS responses and actually do something with them. I mean, that becomes part of your control. You can't just log that data and say, okay, we're good, we're logging this. If something happens, we can go back and look at it. No, you really need to, do something with that, do some analytics on it, take some action on the anomalies and so forth, and kind of going hand in hand with that, leverage the DNS platform, make that part of the, layered defense, use it as a security control, because DNS can be leveraged, as hopefully I've shown here, as a pretty valuable security control. Dot and do, mitigate those. There's a number of ways. There's canary domains, for example, that you can leverage to trip flags to disable DO or cause DO to be bypassed, and you can do things to block at a firewall level, block traffic going to known public resolvers and so forth. But you can also run your own encrypted resolver on the enterprise to terminate dot and do, and then you kind of solve the whole problem there by doing that too. And then of course, protect the DNS from attacks. And I could do a whole talk on different things you can do to actually secure and protect the DNS platform as well. But protect it and leverage it as a security control. All right. So what other questions does anyone have?